Okay, at this time I'd like to invite Khris Dodson back up. He's going to be our moderator for tools for building collaboration and community engagement. And if I could have the panelists also come up.
So while a few of the presentations get loaded up, I kind of want to, so we're early, but whenever I try to take advantage of the extra time, then we end up becoming late. So I'm going to pretend like we're on time. So we'll actually have some Q&A time, I think. So we have 4 presenters in half an hour. So that's about 7 minutes each. They did not let me bring the shepherd stuff on the plane, so I left it at home. I will be standing over here glaring, and Lauren will be using the 2-minute, 1-minute warning. And the best, I'm hoping that we have some time for some meaningful Q&A at the end of this session before lunch. And that's the other reason why I don't want to run late, is because lunch is directly after this. And you've been very brave in sitting here all morning. If you're like me, shivering. So I want to introduce all 4 of our speakers at once, in the order in which they'll and then I'll kind of bring them up as we go. So our first speaker, you probably already know, is Kerry. She's the Constituent Services Manager for New Jersey DEP. She'll kind of be giving, and there may not be 10 of them, but the top 10 tips to engaging community engagement. Community engagement is so important, as the mayor shared, as I've touched on briefly, to really helping you better communicate with your community and better engage them and find ways that they can help you, whether it's a residential business or nonprofit. They all have roles to play. Then after her will be Donna, who's the co-director of Sustainable Community. She's going to be talking about some of the other tools that you can use in working with the community. And then after her, we will have Khris from New Jersey Futures. She's going to give a little highlights of 3 case studies to kind of, so we're going from high view, overview, getting more and more narrow in scope of these presenters. So she's going to share some stories from a few communities. And then last but not least, we have Tim Gaddy she's an environmental justice organizer from New Jersey Clean Water Action, Clean Water Fund. And she's going to talk about this very new, I think, newer program. So that's all of them. Kerry, if you're ready to go, we can start with you. And Lauren will keep some time for us. Thank you, Lauren. And then I'll stand over here in a foreboding way.
Okay, it's always wonderful to be the group between you all and lunch. So we'll do our best to move through this. When I was first brought into this process, one of the requirements in the long-term control plan, as you all know, where is the... There we go. Is public participation. And I was sort of concerned because there didn't seem to be any kind of a template or a manual or guides on how to do public participation. And yet, public input is one of the requirements in the final selection of your plans. And there's some requirements, too. Documenting how the public was informed, how they were engaged, keeping a record of who was attending, and then how the decisions were made, and to what extent the public had an opportunity to participate in that decision-making. And so, I talked to my colleagues, and I said, I think I could come up with a checklist, a way, a process to suggest to folks that they use when they begin the process of community engagement. Community involvement is so important for so many, many reasons. I mean, it provides additional knowledge of your sewershed. Stakeholders can provide information on problems and ideas for solutions. I think, but most importantly, they can have a better understanding of the problems and why they're happening, and then understand why you select certain solutions and ultimately accept the projects that are developed. So what are some of the successful components of an outreach or a communication effort? Well, you establish a team, an advisory team. You get a project coordinator, you have a communications coordinator, you set goals, you identify your stakeholders. I have always found it to be a very successful effort when there's a local liaison to work with who knows the local networks, and you organize a project meeting where you explain the process, the roles of the public, your role, you lay out the tasks that are involved and the timelines, and ultimately, you'll hopefully achieve acceptance of your plan. The role of project coordinator specifically is to kind of pull this team together, to take the complexity of the information and come up with strategies to make it understandable. They're responsible for assigning an outreach coordinator and then determining what the roles of each team member should be, and identifying collaboratively with the communications coordinator what agencies should be involved and what NGOs. The task of the communication coordinator, outreach coordinator, is to track the process, to coordinate information, to assist in identifying stakeholders, to establish those roles that I talked about, to help manage expectations. One of the biggest challenges in working with communities is being realistic about what they can and can't do and what can and can't happen. And if people understand going into a process what they can and can't do and what the outcomes may be, then their participation is more engaged and more realistic. So how do you do all of this? So there's a really good planning process that I have used in my 28 years, much like Pflugh, that I find to be very successful. And I'm going to try to work through this really quickly. This is a training that I give both to our agency folk as well as outside, that usually is a day and a half. So I'm going to do it in 7 minutes. We start with the issue. So in this case, the issue is developing your long-term control plan outreach efforts. You want to establish a SMART goal for your projects. Specific, measurable, realistic, achievable, and timely. Your step 3 is establishing your case record. And you do it by asking yourselves and your team members a series of questions. What do I need to learn? What do I need to share? What will the concerns of my stakeholders be? Who is going to be impacted by, the problems that we're facing in our community and by the solutions that we ultimately will select? What do we already know about fulfilling the requirements of a long-term control plan? How can the public help us? And what are our resources? One of the biggest challenges in an effort is not being realistic about what your resources are. And I don't just mean money. I mean your capacity, your people. Part of that step is also identifying your stakeholders. And as I said, who are they and who is impacted? If you know who's impacted, they are the likely folks that you need to bring into the process. Some of the suggested stakeholders, just knowing what this issue is, are your ratepayers, your industrial users, people who are impacted, you use the impacted waterways, municipal officials, your stormwater coordinators, and then anyone who might be impacted by your project. Do an assessment of these audience, of these stakeholders. Find out how they perceive issues. Find out what important information they have, and learn what the local networks of communication are. Step 5 is identifying your message. What is it we need to convey? What is it that people need? What are the roles? Have we clearly explained them? And does this message ultimately, or do these messages ultimately reflect the goals of the long-term control plan? You have a number of methods that you can use, and I have used virtually every one of these in outreach programs that I develop and have worked with community groups. And each one has pros and cons. But your stakeholders and your team members will tell you the best strategies, the best methods to be used. implement a strategy. Nothing better in the world than a timeline. Identify your tasks, lay out how all of those tasks fit in your timeline, and make sure that someone keeps that timeline on task, on time, that you are following through on achieving the task that you've outlined. Finally, no good plan or outreach effort happens without knowing how to evaluate. And so when you develop your goal and you think about your messages, think about how you're going to evaluate what it is that you've done and how you got there. And frankly, that is also one of the requirements in the long-term control plan, to document how you got there and if you were successful along the way. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Donna, co-director from Sustainable Jersey.
No, unfortunately, my presentation would not load up, so you'll get to hear me kind of do an Andy stand-in as well. But I want to thank you all for coming today. First off, I just want to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Jersey and really how our program is a great opportunity for communities to go forward and engage in community coordination, collaboration, communication, and a model really to help your communities go forward. One of the things that I'm most proud, and Mayor Red, when she spoke about their community's participation in the Sustainable Jersey, and as one of our leading and only 20 out of 20 silver communities, what I'd like to highlight at the beginning is out of the 21 CSO communities in New Jersey, 20 of those communities are participating in the Sustainable Jersey program, and I won't say which one's not. But out of those 20, we have 10 that are certified, and out of those 10, we have 2 that are silver. So what I'd encourage you to do is think about how can you use some of the tools and resources and some of the new tools that are going to be coming into our program to help accelerate community engagement and collaboration in your community. Where we see the role of the green teams are another resource. They are the leadership team that should be established and is operating in your communities to really drive change around the wide range of sustainability issues. So we really encourage you, as you start to go forward and create your community outreach plans, think about utilizing the resources and technical expertise and community connections that are available through your green teams. Concurrently, if you're doing those actions and outreach, that'll earn you points in your certification program. We'd also like to use that team as really the first line of defense and advocates. The Camden Smart Initiative is a great example. I know personally all the members of the Green Team are also heavily involved in the Camden Smart Initiative. And those partnerships and programs and relationships that develop are really what's going to advance success in your communities. So really think about how can you, if your community isn't actively using your Green Team or your Green Team isn't really a driving agent, how you're, as you're working on your long-term control plan and your community outreach model, how to link back in and use that really as a very representative team to reach out to your community around these issues, and sometimes very complex issues. Within the Sustainable Jersey program, we really try to provide guidance and technical expertise. And sometimes explaining what green infrastructure is extremely complex. You as professionals here today know that. And what we hope our tools do is provide it in a layman's language. So when we talk about rain gardens and green infrastructure and resiliency issues, our guidance really does it in a way that helps explain it in a layman's term. So really use that, our program, as a resource to help you. One of the things that we'd like to talk about and share is that we are going to be going forward and putting in a couple new actions into our program. The biggest one I'll share with you today is we are actually going to be incorporating, most of you know NJDEP in 2004 encouraged every municipality in the state of New Jersey to adopt a model stormwater ordinance. At the time, that ordinance really was cutting edge and the most aggressive stormwater management ordinance probably in the U.S. We all know, though, that green infrastructure and some of the techniques, some of the methodologies that we can use, our assessment of what should be regulated and not, has dramatically changed. So in partnership with Natural Resources Defense Council, New Jersey Future, with input from our colleagues at DEP and others, and most importantly, Natural Resources Defense Council, we brought together a working group to think about how could we take that model ordinance and update it. So particularly in our CSO communities, we might be a little bit more aggressive at addressing stormwater management issues. That model ordinance really has 4 fundamental areas that were changed. One is the applicability. What's going to be regulated under this new proposed model? We suggest that communities think about not excluding redevelopment from areas that should be required to do stormwater management activities. We also suggest lowering the threshold for when you would trigger a requirement for stormwater management activities and provide more clear guidance on when and how to use green infrastructure in your plans. And we'd also, in the model, suggest that communities consider including minor development activities and including a lower threshold for those minor development activities. The ordinance gets into a lot of technical details around moving the stormwater retention requirements, increasing the amount of retention, and a lot of thought was given into that technical infeasibility provision. As engineers in the office and planners, we know there's often times when, and this is my opinion, it's easy to use the out that it's technically unfeasible to do these things. So, we can't put impervious pavement in because we use salt and it'll plug and we can never use it. Well, if they're using it in places they get 10 times more snow than we can, there must be a way to use it. So how do we think about creating language in an ordinance that kind of gives better guidance about when it really truly is technically infeasible to use green infrastructure and do stormwater recharge in our communities? So in this model, we provide some guidance and some language along those times. But really all this is just to say that we want our communities to have tools and guidance, and that's what we're hoping to do with the Sustainable Jersey program. As communities and as you are learning about what works with community education and outreach, with your technical provisions, as you're developing your long-term control plans, we would like to use our program to then learn from those experiences you're having in your communities, develop new best practices so that hopefully communities that aren't in CSO communities, that aren't required to do long-term control plans, that we can get the rest of the 540 plus municipalities across the state to start implementing some of these best practices as well. So that's really what we'd like to try and do. So one last plug, our program has been very successful in giving out, well, it's not a lot of money compared to the Environmental Infrastructure Trust. We do give out grants, and we do have a current round of grants that are going to be available for communities that are registered or certified in our program February 1st. And I'm really proud to say over the last 5 years that we've been running this grant program and given out now almost $2 million, we funded some of the first pilots where green infrastructure was done in Camden and Hoboken and across the state of New Jersey. So we would encourage you, if you'd like to get some demonstration projects done, consider applying for our $10,000 or $25,000 grants. But thank you.